Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. Welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Distinguished Speaker Program with Dr. John Esposito. I'm Heidi Shue, President of the Council, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and members, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. This program is being filmed for television, so I will remind you to please turn off your mobile phones as a courtesy to our speaker and to the audience here and at home. Tonight, we are honored to host John Esposito. It is certainly no exaggeration to say that he is one of the world's leading scholars on Islam and certainly America's foremost scholar on Islam, political Islam, and the impact of Islamic movements from North Africa to Southeast Asia. During the last decade, he has focused on addressing the reality versus the perception of Islam as a religion and as a political force in the world. His accomplishments and well-deserved reputation speak for themselves. Dr. Esposito is University Professor of Religion and International Affairs and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, and there also he is the founding director of the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. A former president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies, he is a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders. He has published over 30 books, including The Future of Islam and Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, and he is editor-in-chief of the Oxford University History of Islam, the Islamic World Past and Present, the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, 4 volumes, and the Oxford Dictionary of Islam. He serves as a consultant for our government and others in Asia and Europe, as well as universities, corporations, and the media worldwide. He is seen frequently on major media outlets here and abroad. As a senior scientist at the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, he co-authored Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, which was published in 2008. The book was a product of a mammoth 6-year study undertaken by the Gallup organization, wherein they conducted tens of thousands of hour-long face-to-face interviews with Muslim residents of 35 predominantly Muslim nations, urban, rural, young, old, male, female, illiterate, literate, asking them the questions that we continue to ask ourselves. Why is the Muslim world so anti-American? Who are the extremists? Is democracy something Muslims really want? Et cetera, et cetera. And the answers came directly from the source, a billion Muslims. Tonight, he joins us to explore the global ramifications of Islamophobia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Esposito.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Make sure that doesn't fall off. During the Park 51, the so-called Islamic Center at Ground Zero affair, I went to New York and did an hour with CNN, where they sort of tape you for an hour and then they take clips and they run it into other programs, so they do multi-programs. And I had the same experience there that I had in dealing with I dealt with a number of New York Times reporters, but one person in particular. And that is that at a certain point in the interview, they interrupted it and they said, you know, what's happening? Where's this coming from? Because it wasn't just Park 51, but you remember you had like a tsunami wave of anti-Muslim rhetoric, vandalism, objections to mosques at that time across the country. And the reality of it is that if you were living in Europe, you would be aware of this phenomenon, what we call Islamophobia now. That from 1997 on, that word exists in Europe and is used in different parts of Europe. The reality of it is that if the media were doing its job, you would be aware of it in America, because Kofi Annan in 2004, when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, held an international conference on Islamophobia. in which he talked about the fact, in effect, that it was sad that one had to have a conference on this phenomenon, which now is out there and one needed to address. I wrote a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth, or Reality, and the second edition came out in 1999. And in that edition, it wasn't the whole purpose of the book, but I documented the phenomenon of Islamophobia in Europe and in America. I cited individuals, I cited their articles, I cited what they said. That was in 1999. And here it was, it took until 2010 before suddenly we're aware that this phenomenon exists. And the first and only publication to deal with it, major publication, was Time magazine, that then did a cover story called Is America Islamophobic? And if you actually read that story, while Time does a very good job of interviewing people and being objective, if you read the story, the conclusion you draw is there is a problem with Islamophobia, in America. I would argue that what we saw with Park 51 is the tip of the iceberg. And I'll refer to some data, I think, that will feed that, as well as talk about some commentators and others who've dealt with this. We're passing through especially difficult times right now because the situation is complicated by the staggering economic crisis, by fears of continued terrorist attacks that have spawned a culture of hate, and I want to use that phrase, a culture of hate that threatens the future of the American way of life and values. Before the congressional elections, on a Sunday talk show, you had a woman who's with I think it's the Financial Times of Britain and based in D.C., and she commented in terms of both the anti-immigrant, particularly the whole question at Arizona and its legislation, with regard to illegal aliens, as well as then the Park 51, that she felt that what one was observing in America was this, culture of hate. If you look at the rhetoric, et cetera, and you know that issue's been raised again, whether rightly or wrongly, with regard to what happened in Tucson. But the fact is, even if it's wrongly with regard to Tucson, the fact that it is brought in as a possibility means we've had this phenomenon out there, and we know it's out there. The legacy of 9/11 and the post 9/11 terrorist attacks have also been exploited by media commentators, by hardline Christian Zionist ministers, and I'll talk about some of them, and by political candidates whose fear-mongering targets Islam and Muslims. Islamophobia is fast becoming, for Muslims, what anti-Semitism is for Jews. Now, I'm not comparing Islamophobia quantitatively with anti-Semitism. Understand that. I'm saying for Muslims, it's becoming what anti-Semitism is for Jews. If we look at the phenomenon in Europe with the new anti-immigrant parties, if you look at the kind of platforms that they run on, and if you see how well they did in the last elections. And I'll talk again about that and the rhetoric that's out there. It's rooted in a hostility and intolerance towards religious and cultural beliefs and a specific religious or racial group. It threatens the democratic fabric of both America and European societies. And like anti-Semites and racists, Islamophobes deny that the phenomenon exists. And that's what they're doing. From their point of view, they're just telling it like it is. That's what all of these people are like. I'm not talking about people who deny Muslim extremists. I'm talking about people who say things like, no, Islam is evil. And in fact, if you're a good Muslim, you have a psychological problem. Even if you look at the new atheists, Sam, who's the philosopher? Sam Harris, right. I mean, he has a phrase in his book that in effect says that if you are a believing Muslim, you're deranged. Okay? And there are others who deal in that kind of rhetoric. There's a group called ACT, and if you actually look at the founder and her statement, she will literally say that the enemy is any believing Muslim. Any Muslim who prays is dangerous to America. Okay. Despite their integration as American citizens, Muslim civil liberties, their rights and freedom of religion, are often threatened amidst charges that mosques are monuments to terrorism. Remember that phrase was used at Park 51, but then it became a calling card across the country for a mosque in Tennessee or in Oklahoma, where suddenly it becomes a monument to terrorism. I mean, you're removing it away, but the phrase caught on. Opposition to mosque construction in locations from New York City and Staten Island to Tennessee and California has become not just a local, but now a national political issue. Across the U.S., a major debate has erupted over the building of Park 51. On June 22nd, the New York Post ran this editorial: "There's no denying the elephant in the room. Neither is there any rejoicing over the mosques, because where there are mosques, there are Muslims, and where there are Muslims, there are problems. Where there are synagogues, there are Jews, and where there are Jews, there are problems. Where there are African Americans, and where there are African Americans, there are problems." Of those three examples, two of them everyone knows now, including editors of newspapers, people with TV, that you just can't do that. Maybe you could do it 30 years ago, 40 years you can't. But for one group, it's fair game. The author warns of New York becoming New Yorkistan, just as London has become Londistan, degenerated by a Muslim community into a launching pad for terrorists. Now, some people like to say, but that's the New York Post. But that's beside the point. That is an American publication. It is a newspaper that is read. In California, a Tea Party rally in protest of an Islamic center encouraged protesters to bring their dogs because Muslims hate Jews, Christians, women, and dogs. There's a clean sweep. It's really, pretty cool. Christians from a right-wing church in Dallas, Texas, traveled to Bridgeport, Connecticut, to a mosque there to confront worshipers. These Christians, remember, we Christians believe in turning the other cheek. We believe that our religion is one of compassion. We dissociate ourselves from, the violence and any use of sort of violence and warfare when it's convenient. So what did they say to Muslims who were coming out? They shouted murderers at the young children leaving the mosque. Carrying placards, they angrily declared Islam is a lie, and this is even better. Jesus hates Muslims. That's what's good about self-righteous Christians. They actually talk to Jesus. I mean, they speak for God. This is what Jesus wants. You watch the Pat Robertson show, and it's amazing. And he does well financially, so I think, God helps you both ways. Then we have politicians like Newt Gingrich, who warned of the danger of Sharia taking over American courts when nobody's been asking for it. But he proactively took that. And then also compared, you remember, Muslims at Park 51 to Nazis outside the Holocaust Museum. We have Republican Rex Duncan of Oklahoma, who declared there's a war for the survival of America to keep the Sharia from creeping in the American court system. Congresswoman Sue Merrick, definitely one of our more perceptive ones, and Congressman Paul Brown from Georgia charged Muslim student interns on the Hill were part of a secret infiltration of Muslim spies into key national security committees on Capitol Hill. Okay. What fuels the fires of discrimination against Muslims in America and Europe? There's no lack of hate speech in the media to empower Islamophobia. One can think of Glenn Beck. One can think of Sean Hannity. One can think of O'Reilly. A whole host of people. I can't knock O'Reilly completely because I did a show once and he spiked my books like nobody else has. But you listen to the kinds of things they said. And again, I often say to people, take a newspaper or take these TV pieces and substitute the word Judaism for Islam, Jew for Muslim, and do the same thing with African Americans or do it for Italian Americans, unlike the time when I was growing up. You wouldn't dare go down that road. And that's what shows you the danger. Like anti-Semitism and xenophobia, Islamophobia has long and historic deep roots. Its contemporary resurgence has been triggered by the significant influx of Muslims in the West in the late 20th century, but especially by things like the Iranian Revolution, hostage-taking, acts of terrorism in the 80s and 90s, and of course the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Center, as well as in Europe. So again, one doesn't deny that acts of violence and terrorism takes place, that we have a problem with extremists. It's the question of how do we approach the phenomenon, and to what extent do we take extremists and brushstroke an entire people. We don't do that, for example, when we deal with my faith, Roman Catholicism. and clergy, when in fact we look at a history of anti-Semitism, and when we look at the problems that occurred recently with regard to pedophilia. Well, there may be some people that do it, but if they do it, there'll be a lot of us who'll say, well, wait a minute, now those people, when they do that, are being anti-Catholic in not doing that kind of making that kind of discrimination. So I want to move through some of this because I like to spend a fair amount of time on Q&A. The situation became significantly exacerbated after 9/11. The British Crime Survey 2000 estimated that in 1999, the number of racially motivated offenses in England and Wales was 280,000. The risk of being a victim of a racially motivated crime was 4.2% for Pakistanis and Bengalis, who are primarily Muslim, and 0.0% for whites. However, 9/11 then exacerbated the situation so that in 2002, the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia published a summary done after 9/11, which documented increased and widespread acts of discrimination and warned of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism becoming acceptable in European society. In a follow-up report in 2004, the Runnymede Trust concluded that Islamophobia was a pervasive feature of British society. But we in America would look at that and say, see, they've got a problem. They're not multicultural societies. They don't have a history. They're not a country of immigrants, who are able to deal, therefore, with new immigrants, etc., which, by the way, is a bit of a myth. If you actually look at our history, you can see waves of how we actually did not deal with immigrants. Blacks, Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, Italian Americans, when they were all coming over, etc. We go through these ways. And then once they get established and become second generation, then they look at Haitians and Mexicans, etc., and say, why are we letting these aliens in? After 9/11, you had an Italian who owned a gas station. You could see a wonderful Italian name. All Italian names are wonderful. Everything Italian's wonderful. And let me just say this. I say this all over the world, and I'm very serious about this. There is no Italian mafia. It was created by a group of Irish people who have projected that myth across the world. But we have nothing to do with that phenomenon. It doesn't mean that I'm culturally in denial. I just want to get that out there. But here you had this Italian American. I'm sure literally his grandparents came from Italy. And he had a sign, send them all back to where they came from. Send them all back. He wasn't just talking about the attackers on the plane. Or when I flew out right after 9/11 to speak in California, and a young kid goes by, the whole back of his car had, kill them all and let Allah decide. This kind of broad brushstroke. And he wasn't the only kid that had that sign. That sign was out there a good deal. The international scope of Islamophobia, as I said, was recognized by Kofi Annan, who said, when the world is compelled to coin a new term to take account of increasingly widespread bigotry, that is a sad and troubling development. Such is the case with Islamophobia. As he said, since September 11th, attacks on the United States, many Muslims, particularly in the West, have found themselves the objects of suspicion, harassment, and discrimination. A 2006 USA Today Gallup poll found that substantial minorities of Americans admitted to having negative feelings of prejudice. And that continues right up to the latest Gallup polling. At twice the rate that Americans will say they have it towards other religions. Okay? Admit that level of prejudice. Nearly, fewer than half of the respondents believe U.S. Muslims could be loyal to the U.S. Nearly 1/4 of Americans, 22%, said they would not like a Muslim as a neighbor. 31% said they would feel nervous if they noticed a Muslim man on their flight. 18% they would be nervous if they noticed a Muslim woman on their flight. About 4 in 10 Americans favored more rigorous security measures for Muslims who are U.S. citizens, like ID cards. 4 years later, we see no improvement. A 2010 Gallup poll, by the way, you can get this all on Gallup's website. It's Center for Muslim Studies, had more than 4 in 10 Americans, 43%, admit to feeling at least a little prejudice towards Muslims, more than twice the number that who feel that way about Christians, only 18%, Jews 15%. 9% of Americans admit that they feel a great deal of prejudice. Mosque construction, as I said, has become a particularly, because it's so symbolic, a particularly favorite target. Unlike only a few years ago, the way in which you would stop a mosque, and I've been in Georgia and Mississippi, is that communities would say it's going to bring more traffic. Now when you look at the objections, people literally say things like it's a monument to terrorism, or they're going to have guns in the mosque. I mean, all you have to do is you can get on the internet and see these statements that are out there. We know that there are radicals in the mosque without providing any evidence. One of the things I said to people is, I don't have a problem with somebody tapping a phone of a mosque if you go to the authorities and you provide reason for doing it. But when you have somebody who was going to be a presidential candidate, and fortunately did not fare all that well, who came down when he was governor of Massachusetts and spoke in Washington and opened up the idea that maybe we needed to tap the phones of mosques, that's a lot different than saying, we need to have a higher degree of vigilance. And at that time, if you had looked at FBI reports, major FBI reports, if you want to see it, look at David Cole's Less Safe, Less Free. It's a wonderful read, Less Safe, Less Free. Or you can look at my book and pay less for it. But David teaches at Georgetown, he's a colleague, and he writes a much better book as a lawyer. But you will see stats from the FBI. They talk about the number of Muslims that they've investigated, the number of Muslims that they've called in to talk to. They talk about the nature of mosques at that time. Again, it doesn't mean that we haven't had some problems, that we may not continue to have some problems. But that's a world of difference from that statement and the broader brushstroking. When you have, in June 2010, a Republican candidate in the 6th District of Tennessee opposed to a Muslim community's proposal to build a new mosque, who makes a statement that says that the Muslim Center is not part of a religious movement, but rather this is a political one. And you see that line a lot from Tennessee and also in Oklahoma. Islam's really not a religion, it's a political. See, because once you say that, then you can say whatever you want. You can deny people's religious freedoms, etc. She then wrote, until the American Muslim community find it in their hearts to separate themselves from their evil radical counterparts, to condemn those who want to destroy our civilization and will fight against them, we're not obligated to open our society to any of them. A common phrase. How many of you have heard or thought or asked yourself, why don't Muslims speak out more against terrorism? Raise our hands. Okay, take a picture of all these bigots. I want to put this on TV tomorrow. No, I'm only kidding. This is a very common thing, and you should ask that question. And why should you? Because, in fact, Muslims have, many of them, from the day after September 11, made statements publicly, but why don't you see them? Because they're not in the media. Why doesn't the media cover them? Write to your media. When Tom Friedman twice in the last 6 years has a column in which he raises that question, when Tom Friedman has to know better than that, and Tom Friedman isn't aware that in his own newspaper, 8 days after 9/11, the Beckett Fund, not exactly a Muslim fund, had a one-page ad on this with statements from major Muslim religious leaders denouncing 9/11. And in fact, there are plenty of websites. Go to beliefnet.com and others. The University of North Carolina has a website that will give you statements made by major Muslim leaders in America, in the Muslim world, not only with regard to 9/11, but on most major events that have taken place since then dealing with this phenomenon. They almost never get covered. How many of you know the content, not just have heard the phrase, the Aman message? How many of you know of a common word? Okay. Compared to the hands before. We got one hand there. We got my hand. We win. Okay. These are two major statements made by Muslims. One, brought together for the first time because of globalization of travel and communication, a cross-section of Muslims across the world. So you could finally do that, not just local, the Imam message. And it attempted to delegitimate extremists by doing what? Defining what true Islam is. And they had members of all the different, as it were, Islamic groups. I want to use the word sects, but that's not a correct term. And when you're from Brooklyn, S-E-C-T-S sounds like S-E-X. So then we get into a whole mess of stereotypes beyond that. But the reality of it is, from all different groups, defining what a good Muslim is, what it means, okay, what extremism is, who's qualified to give a fatwa in order to delegitimate radical imams, but also to delegitimate people like bin Laden and say they're not qualified to do it. So you've got this major statement done by these major Muslim religious leaders, and they gave their own fatwas on it. Virtually no major media coverage in the United States. So the charge that Muslims don't condemn terrorism is simply a false charge. And in fact, if you're on the internet, it's out there all the time. Most major groups now rush to get it out, to get statements out every time something happens. But you've got to go to the internet. The same thing happens with groups that are accused of, are investigated by our government. You have a group in this area where supposedly, I haven't been able to corroborate the numbers, I mean, myself, but something like more than $300 million was spent investigating this group. All kinds of stories on the internet about that. Nobody talks about the fact that a month ago, the government dropped the entire case. After years and all that money, had nothing with regard to this group. The group was exonerated, etc. There were no major stories. No stories in the very newspapers in Washington that covered all of the negative stuff. This is part of the problem that we have in terms of having a context to be able to deal with two things that are a real problem. One, the threat of terrorist attacks. Two, the broader issue of Islamophobia as a form of, if you will, racism. Okay. In the aftermath of many of these attacks, not only in America, but particularly in Europe, in countries that were multicultural, like Britain, you had other European countries saying, doesn't work. The French said that to the Brits. See, you're multicultural, doesn't work. It actually feeds terrorism. Okay? And there was that accusation vis-a-vis our own country, which of course is a multicultural country. Now, part of the problem that you have when you simply kind of brushstroke in that way is that you then wind up with people who say it's not enough to integrate into a society. And that's what many of us were faced. How do you come as an Italian-American Catholic and be American and as American as anybody else and marry a wife who is Eastern European in background, and so you share a lot in common, but you also retain your differences, versus total assimilation. And so the drumbeat in Europe is total assimilation, whatever that means. Total assimilation. Rather than the ability to see that you can have a healthy multiculturalism, that diversity can be a problem, but diversity also brings strengths. We now know that. Now that we've had our problems with our visas getting foreign students, now we're concerned about figuring out a way to get Asians to come here and study more. You know, we know that in terms of our country and its future and its development educationally, et cetera, we not only want to educate others from overseas, but part of the way in which we become stronger is that many of those who come, or a fair number of them who are very talented, stay here. So we know that there are strengths that come, from diversity, rather than trying to deny that diversity. But instead we have people in the media, political leaders and commentators on the right warning of soft terrorism plots in America and Europe. You have the notion, for example, that, well, you have terrorists, not only in the politics in the region, but also here. They're obvious, right? And then you have, quote, mainstream moderate Muslims, but they're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're kind of fifth columnists. But not having to provide hard data. Let me give you an example. There's a statement out there that's used a lot, that 85% of our mosques are radical, okay? Anytime I raise with anybody who asks me that question, in the media or refers to somebody they interviewed who said it, not one time do they say that anybody provides hard data for that statement. That's what I mean, where all things become capable. And you develop this kind of stereotype. The issue that you then run into is that we then begin to use indiscriminately not only the notion of Muslim with terrorist, but we use the word Muslim in a religious sense of everything. So when there are riots in ghettos outside of Paris, okay, among many North Africans who don't even practice their faith, and the riots have to do with being excluded from society, living in ghettos, having limited access to education, having limited access to transportation, and good studies by both good French scholars, as others will say this. In other words, these are social issues. They get reported and the word Muslim gets used. You see, it's like dealing with Italian problems, for example, when Italians first came over and, let's say, lived in Harlem and other areas, but reporting it as Italian, but everybody thinking that by saying that you also mean Catholic. So then it becomes, that it's not just that they're Italian, and it's common to Southern Italians to do whatever it is you think they do, but it must be something also about their faith. And when we identify people from the Muslim world, more often than not, a lot of us don't say those Moroccans did this or it's a Moroccan neighborhood. We use the term Muslim in this broad, indiscriminate way. And so many educational issues, many social issues, when you frame them with the word Muslim rather than saying they're North African Arabs, immediately one then raises the question, is there something about Islam that is antithetical to whatever that problem is? Modern education, democracy, etc. And so then you wind up with issues, the cultural issues, that then are also used. Things like the Danish cartoons, the conflicts over the hijab, which are then not seen, which are then cast simply as religious issues and not issues that have to do with freedoms. Now, when you look at data, you look at the Gallup data, the World Poll, right through 2008 and the latest Gallup data into 2010. Again, you can go to the Gallup website. When you ask Muslims, what are the things that they resent? First of all, if you ask Muslims, what do you admire about America? Despite grievances, they talk about their admiration for our technology, our work ethic, our rule of law, our democracy, our freedoms, etc., okay? And talk about wanting those kinds of things. And yet 54% of Americans, when asked, what do you admire about Islam and Muslims, say nothing or I don't know. But now, when you ask Muslims about their grievances, they will front a grievance, and they'll also talk about what needs to be done to improve relations, i.e. correct this grievance. And what do they talk about? Respect for Islam and Muslims. Showing respect for Islam, the faith of Islam and Muslims, and part of the respect for Muslims, the notion that Muslim blood should be as valued as non-Muslim blood. And there are a lot of practical ways in which one sees, the way in which people can talk about, you saw those quotes I gave before, but just think to yourself also, we are very capable, and we can document every American soldier who was killed in Iraq or Afghanistan or wounded. And yet, we somehow don't know what the figures are when it comes to Iraqis and Afghans. And then when we get figures, let's say, put out by Johns Hopkins or whatever, you'll get an accusation, let's say, from government saying those figures are inflated. But you won't have anybody come back and demonstrate that they've been collecting hard data on the numbers of people who, it's very interesting. I was in a church recently. Since we're on TV, I want people to know that I go to church on occasion. And I was in a church just on Sunday. And what struck my wife and I is that normally there's a prayer that's said for our soldiers who are in harm's way in Afghanistan and Iraq. For the first time, it seemed to me, I now heard them introduce, and all the innocents who are killed in the country. Innocents of both sides, but they use that phrase a lot of times. And it's not that people are doing it deliberately. It's that it's not even part of our consciousness, to think that way or to frame it. Okay. German Chancellor Angela Merkel warned that her country's attempts to build a post-war multicultural society had failed utterly. Okay? Why? Because of the Muslims in Germany, particularly Turkish Muslims. In fact, hard data done by German research firms shows that, yes, there are segments of the Muslim community that live in ghettos, that don't integrate all that well, that are on welfare. But significant numbers of Turkish Muslims want and are moving up through the system. The very data that comes out of that society contradicts. And again, if you go to the Gallup website, you will see data coming with regard to Muslims in Europe, and you'll see what Muslims in Europe, how they see themselves as whether or not they want to be citizens, whether or not they see themselves as wanting to be integrated, whether they see themselves loyal, how they feel about having non-Muslims living next to them. You look at those percentages and compare it to the indigenous non-Muslim population, and you see this interesting gap. So part of it is that often the gap should be a non-existent gap, but it's what we've sort of come to think or believe. Now, what happens then, okay, is that she says, we feel bound to the Christian image of humanity. That is what defines us. Those who do not accept this are in the wrong place here. Ironically, Europe has a major problem with secularism and tends to distance itself too often from its identification with its Christian roots. And there have been debates in the European Union. The Pope himself has been concerned about not appropriating that. Now, what happens at the same time is you then have a German who publishes a book in which he says that the country's 4 million Muslims were dumbing down society and that the national Christian identity of Germans was in danger of being lost. A poll was done after that on how many people would vote for him for a senior government position. 25% of the population immediately stepped forward. I mean, this is somebody who has no political profile. It's not like Geert Wilders. So those tensions exist in a society. Suspicion, anger, and hostility towards the Muslim community in America surfaced with Ground Zero, as I said. But the net effects seem to chastise the millions of Muslim Americans as if they bore a collective guilt for being insufficiently sorry for acts they never committed. A Muslim professional friend of mine said that. I wrote to her, and she's somebody who writes a lot on these issues, and in fact deals with government officials, etc. And she said, in a lot of the rhetoric that's out there, she said, the message that sometimes I hear when I look at Park 51 and others, it's as if we're being blamed, mainstream Muslims, for not being apologetic enough. And so sometimes it implies that we're somehow guilty because we belong to this group called Muslim, that we then are, guilty and should be apologizing all the time for it. That's an issue. A poll by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life detected a real and lingering tendency to see Islam and Muslims through the lens of extremism. The study found that the public's view of Islam has worsened since 2005. Gallup has also found that. 30% have a favorable view, 38% don't. A Gallup poll found that 53% of Americans view Islam in an unfavorable light. After Park 51, Washington Post did a poll that found Islam's unfavorable image creeping up to 49%. You remember that after President Obama went to Park 51 and made a statement, the number of people who thought he was a Muslim jumped from something like 18 and in some polls to 28 or 38%, just on the basis of a statement that he made when he went there. We are, in the words of my father, as he used to use to his 3 sons whenever we disagreed with him, too bright to be that stupid. We are too bright and too sophisticated, culturally and educationally, to fall into that trap. And yet, somehow, we do. Okay, conclusion. The wave of increasing Islamophobia that underscores the need to continue to educate ourselves about Islam and American religious diversity has to be taken now as a lesson, and a lesson that we have to be far more proactive in addressing. It's not enough to just think, I want to be really clear, I think it's a tip of an iceberg, what we saw. And the fact is we need to address that. And we are in some ways. In many of our schools now, students are being educated better, et cetera. But we need to provide far more of a context for our populations. Gallup has found, for example, Gallup data, that the more open-minded in our surveys are, guess who? The younger generation. Why? Many of you grow up, go to school, grow up in neighborhoods that are very multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-racial. A lot of the older population, a lot of you people here who are a good 20 years older than I am, this is, by the way, I do my hair to get this color. For a lot of us, we grew up in a white America for many of us. It's one of the problems you often see in Europe. When people talk about we want to get back to our German and British values, I give lectures. But for a lot of the older generation, they're struggling. What they're really saying is they want to get back to the way things were, rather than waking up or living in a society where increasingly, it's not just, there's no problem tolerating a minority, a small minority. The problem is when the minority begins to look like a big minority that may become the majority. And then your real sort of, tolerance comes in. I like to put it another way, to do a spin. And if you can't follow this, it's okay. I mean, it means that I'm not being clear, which may be the first time, but let's do it anyway. The reality of it is that we have no great problem, most of us, especially in recent years, having our consciousness raised with regard to the other, as long as we're in the driver's seat. And so, for example, even if you look at Muslim civilization, when Muslims were in the driver's seat, they were very inclusive. They brought in the best of learning, the best of people to translate, the best of scholars, etc. When you begin to feel that you're being overwhelmed by that other, then you get threatened. Think about after the fall of the Soviet Union, when we began to think about whether Japan would be the next economic power or the European Union. Think about the outrage of some when people said, look at Japanese companies, they're so successful, we should copy their model, very literally. And for a lot of people, it was, wait a second. You know, are we going to go that? We're used to expecting that we're the leaders, right? And so, and therefore, we expect that other people will learn our language, that they will want to go to our schools, have our curriculum. Can you imagine if we then had said at that time, well, what we really need to do is have more of us go to Japan, learn the language, you know, learn their culture, etc. All of a sudden, that gets much more at your identity. And that's why there's such a concern about numbers all of the time. It's not just the threat. Even before 9/11, there were people that were concerned about how large the Muslim population was going to become. Because it's numbers that matter. And ironically, they misinterpret the numbers. Okay? If I say to you such and such a percentage of people in America are Christian or Jewish, you don't presume that they all go to synagogue and church. You presume that some of them are practicing, some of them are just cultural or historical. Yet when I talk to people about the number of Muslims, I can tell if I say that there are 4 to 6 million Muslims, most people in their gut think that I mean that there are 4 to 6 million Muslims who go to, I was going to say go to synagogue regularly. Whoa! Talk about interreligious understanding. But that they all are mosque going. People don't think that there are plenty of Muslims who don't go to mosque regularly. There are plenty of Muslims who see themselves very secular. There are plenty of Muslims who... It's when we begin to fear that minority. We're doing that a lot now with, for example, if you take Mexicans. If you live in certain states, when people say, is he or she an alien? And I move back and forth between 2 states on this issue. What they really mean when they apply it is not just are they Mexican. They apply it to Nicaraguans, to Colombians. They go for a certain kind of skin color. You know, that shows you when you're really beginning to feel threatened. When you're really beginning to feel threatened. Okay, so with regard to the way forward. Islamophobia will continue to be fed to the extent that we fail to distinguish between the actions of religious extremists and terrorists and the vast majority of Muslims. Any terrorism expert will tell you that if you look at the Muslim population, whether in America or the world, the number of extremists or terrorists is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1% of actual terrorists. I mean, it's a very, very small but dangerous number. It's a very small number, okay? Versus then that broad base of people. If we don't make that distinction in our culture, notice what I'm saying. I'm not just saying in our schools. In our popular culture, we have a problem. It's a natural problem. Islamophobia, like anti-Semitism, will not be eradicated easily or soon. We all, governments, policymakers, the media, educational institutions, religious and corporate leaders, have a critical role to play in countering the voices of hate. The exclusivist theologies and ideologies, whether they're exclusivist theologies of Muslims or of the Christian right. President Obama attempted to address that issue and has in his Cairo speech and other speeches. Think about the last elections. Mr. McCain, who couldn't stand the Christian right in an earlier iteration of his career, cultivated it, and then all of a sudden he referred to Ron or Rod Parsley as his pastor. And John Hagee signed on. And then what did we discover? These are people who have mega churches, mega audiences in media, and who are anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. They write books that are anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. And when it was pointed out that that was the case with John Hagee, at first Mr. McCain did not back down. When did McCain back down? I'm not trying to be anti-McCain here. When did he back down? Anybody remember? When they pointed out that Hagee had also been anti-Catholic. Because now we're a significant number. We're not the minority of those dark-colored Southern Europeans. We're now seen as a significant number financially, you know, etc. Okay? But these people played a significant role. And Park 51, when you get a Newt Gingrich and a Sarah Palin, and you get people who are running for governor and Congress, or who are already in Congress, and they're saying what they said, they're not playing to the redneck yahoos. They're playing to the fact that they thought there was a significant number of the electorate who would deliver. So it's indicating they're not members of racist parties. They're members of our mainstream political parties. That's the struggle that we have to deal with and we have to continue to deal with. Okay. What we have to do then is, first of all, recognize that we do have what I would call a social cancer. Leaders of all faith communities and their congregations have to begin a national and local conversation. We've had the dialogues. I'm talking beyond this. It's not enough for top religious leaders to come together and say, come let us reason together. And then do nothing else or hold a few meetings. They have to change the curriculum in seminaries, in madrasas, that train the next generation of priests, ministers, rabbis, and imams. Once you get to that, because they're the people that then train the next generation of parents. You see? Having prescient theologians and others is nice, writing about these issues. But who has the access to the masses? And so there's got to be that trickle-down effect that goes right into the training as well as of religious leaders, as well as then into the training of not only the next generation of religious leaders, but that gets into our schools and our universities for the next generation of our students. And we're seeing that at places like Georgetown and others. The one thing 9/11 has done, it has increased enormously interest in the area and in these issues. Politicians, whom polls show have lost the respect of the American people, have to demonstrate their integrity and denounce those of their own party who are willing to train on hate speech. It's not enough for politicians to just walk away. We need to get to a point where people simply say, I want to totally disassociate myself from that. I love Newt Gingrich, but I want to disassociate myself from that statement that he made. We've begun to do that on racism. We had a number of incidents in the last few years where you've had politicians that got into trouble because they were soft on older politicians from the Old South who had been racist and made racist statements. We have to have politicians who are willing to really step up proactively. I noticed a lot of politicians who made statements, or a fair number, but the majority of them, with regard to Park 51, talked about, and it's good to talk about the civil liberties of people, but many of them never even used the word Muslim or Islam. In other words, they didn't help contextualize that statement and put a face on it. That becomes very important. With regard to the media, I don't believe that anybody should say to the media, you can't cover stuff. What the media has to be pressed on is contextualizing. If you provide enough coverage so that people have a context, then when they see an issue, they place it in a context. If you don't have any context, if all your stories about Italian Americans are mafia stories, and your TV shows show them as gangsters, okay, then what do you expect in terms of the way people are going to see that scene? And finally, we all have an obligation to deal with this issue. I really do think that this is a pressing issue. And it's a no-brainer to say the next time around could be worse. And when we're going to take it seriously is when somebody firebombs a mosque and somebody gets killed, or a group of people get killed. And then they offer the excuse, I didn't think anybody was in it. Or when somebody does go in and shoots up some Muslims, and we'll want to simply say, well, they were crazy, without saying they may have been crazy, but did we, in terms of our popular culture, provide a context for that person who's nutty? I'm not relating Tucson to this at all, but what I am saying is that if you have, so put all of Islamophobia aside right now, but if you look at what went on in Tucson, if you've got a kid who is a little off, is on drugs, whatever the reason, but he also is living in a popular culture, okay, in which he's getting all kinds of messages, and therefore, if he's looking for somebody to be mad at, he's getting messages about the kinds of people that you can blame this on. It's like people who are really suffering from what happens with the economy, and they're looking for somebody to blame, but instead, when they get a political commentator, it's not somebody who really contextualizes in a constructive way, but somebody who just puts out, just like a one-side blame. Well, hell, if that person for them is giving them gospel, the danger is you can develop then a kind of culture of hate that just feeds off when in fact is a one-sided story. What we have to get back to is the reality that historically, if you go back, many knew. And that is whether it's our language of talking about God or it's dealing with reality itself. Reality is not black and white. And so we have to begin to realize that when we deal with other cultures and other people, when we deal with social problems, when we deal with economic problems, it's not a black and white situation. We've got to move beyond that kind of rhetoric. Now, it's interesting, for example, our politicians are saying they're going to move away from it for a while, but everybody knows there's going to be a quiet period after Tucson, and if we're not careful, we'll go back to that kind of rhetoric. The problem with that rhetoric is that when you then tease it out beyond the debates over health care, et cetera, in which people are willing to scream and yell and walk towards their person and say, you know, I'm going to come back and get you, you know, and then later on say, well, I didn't mean I was going to do something physical to him or to her. The reality of it is it also gets translated in the way that people feel about illegal aliens. It's also the way in which they feel about brown-skinned people. It's also about the way in which they feel about X and Y. Thank you. I apologize. That wasn't what I expected to say, so Heidi will be able to trash me, and it'll be legitimate after. And if you are interested in knowing what this book is about, you can just come up. There are little flyers here, but feel free not to. It just tells you about the book and who contributed and the kind of topics that are covered. So we have time for Q&A. Yeah.
Would you comment on the, you didn't touch on the
Yeah.
question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how that plays?
Yeah.
The Podhoretz sort of approach. They're the ones that were using this term most aggressively.
Excellent question. Palestine and Israel, for example, you can't escape the fact that it's not only a major political issue, and it's an intractable nut that no president that we've ever had has been able to deal with, and no president that we've had has been willing to bite the bullet on, which is to risk their political future, to really lead on that. But the fact is that it also is a major divider in some segments, religiously, and the way in which we paint that problem and the way in which it continues to move on. I just read a document today. I don't want to mention the group because I might get the wrong group. But it does a really good job on American Muslims in the first part, in terms of stats, in terms of background. And then it moves to major Muslim organizations, okay? Every one of them is painted as sympathizer with terrorism, okay? And it has allegations that have been made and are no longer seen as true, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a major group, and this document is being circulated. Well, not only for members of that faith, but for a lot of Americans, they're going to believe that, And that impact, and a lot of it comes from the tension over the Palestinian-Israeli situation.
A friend of mine at work constantly raises the question of why don't moderate Muslims take control of their situation? And I pointed out to him that many Muslims are in fact fighting with and paying with their lives in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, trying to moderate the world's view of Islam. And then 2 days later, he asked me the same question. Even after the governor of Pakistan was killed 2 weeks ago. And this is an intelligent, educated man, but he has this solidified, calcified view.
Problem we have, I often say, I mean this quite literally, I got into the field in the late 60s and 70s when there was no great interest in Islam and Muslims, okay? I was a Christian theologian who then studied Hinduism and Buddhism. I was suggested that I study Islam, and I said I'm not interested. I knew very little about Arabs and Muslims, but the little that I knew, I figured why would I want to do that? And there was no interest until the Iranian Revolution. But I still say today that 40 years later, I have the best job in the world. I'm asked the same questions. I mean that literally, okay? The same questions. The only difference is I now get paid to answer. But I mean that quite literally. I'm asked the same. And do we have a learning curve? I mean, how often do we raise questions like, are Islam and modernization compatible? For 20 years we've been asking that. Is Islam compatible with democracy? How about gender rights? Sure, there are lots of problems that Muslim women face, but how about the other side? You know, are people aware of what's actually going on? It's a major problem, and I don't know how you ultimately. It is something that that I struggle with. After 9/11, I was writing a book called Unholy War, but my wife kept saying to me, "You've really got to write a Q&A." So I wrote a book, What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, Q&A. But I had said to her, well, I've written an introduction to Islam. So she said, you keep complaining, this is after 9/11, as you did after the Gulf War in Kuwait, that when you talk to media, they're asking you the same questions. When you talk to government, they're asking, and she said, so then you got to do the questions and do the answers. And for some people it works, and for some it doesn't. If you saw some of the emails I get, I mean some of the hate emails, even when you respond to it, and there's an interesting email. What I want to say is it's in our DNA in terms of popular culture. In other words, the last 20 or 30 years, if you're exposed in a culture and you slur a group over and over and over again, you know, in different ways, it comes in, okay? But the reality of it is that it has become so accepted that it's just very hard. You know, people just don't, you know, for certain people. There was a guy, I get Googled whenever my name appears or a book that I've done. So I see what everyone needs to know about Islam. I thought, wow, that's nice. And I read this guy, and he begins by saying what a racist pig he is. He's anti-Muslim. And I think, oh, good, he's then going to say that he read my book and it changed his life. What does he say? I thought to myself, maybe I should, maybe I don't have it completely right. Maybe I should look for something that told me whatever I need to know about Islam. He said, then I thought for a minute and thought, no, I don't want to waste my time. I'm happy thinking what I think. You know, I mean, there's a way in which that world gets contextualized, and it's just there. And any of us who know, if you grew up and dealt with members of your family who were deeply racist or deeply anti-Semitic, you didn't sit Uncle Joe down and think that with a 1-hour conversation, you were going to turn him around. Just wasn't going to happen, you know? And I find in our society now, but what makes me depressed is that it's not just Uncle Joe who didn't have a high school education. We now have people who are very bright who live in that experience. And they say things and they don't even realize. And not just about Muslims. You know, this phrase, illegal alien, that used time and time again by friends of mine who are corporate people who went to university, and they use it in the most blanket way about people. Breaking through that is a real challenge. You know, there is no silver bullet. I can only take one more. Time is up. I'm really sorry. Thank you all for coming.
Please join me in thanking Dr. John Esposito again.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.